So we're going to be looking at our first text today, Amrita Pritam's novella, Pinjar, which translates from Punjabi into English as The Skeleton. Amrita Pritam is probably the most important Punjabi writer of the 20th century, and her work is particularly important for what we're doing in this course, in large part because of what happens to her home region around the time India and Pakistan are partitioned into separate nations in 1947. Right, part of the region known as Punjab goes to Pakistan, part of it goes to India. So most of what we're going to be talking about today is how India came to, what British India came to be, how it came to be partitioned into separate nations, and how that affects the way we should read this particular text, what it has to do with the movement of bodies, the movement of human beings in this particular text. All right, so first, let's talk briefly about the history of British India. Now, like a lot of British colonies, British India basically starts out as a corporate venture, not a political venture, not a crown venture. This happened in the Americas as well, right? Most of our early cities, Boston, New York, for example, were begun as essentially company towns, right? They were owned by a corporation that then sort of built them out. The same thing happened in India, right? The British East India Company built 3 major trading cities in what was then the Mughal Empire with the permission of its rulers. So the cities that are today called Madras, Kolkata, and Mumbai, the British called them Calcutta and Bombay, were founded by the British. Right? These were British cities in India, and sort of the seats of British corporate and political power. And all 3 of these cities become, over time, powerful, independent political actors within the Mughal Empire. There are also, at the same time, rival cities being set up by the French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. And in fact, even when most of India is under British control, these French-controlled and Portuguese-controlled areas remain. For example, Goa on the western coast of India remained Portuguese territory into the 1950s, I think. Now, in 1757, the British East India Company stops acting solely as a trade consortium and starts acting as a real political power in its own right. And from these trading cities it's founded, begins asserting military and political authority over large swaths of South Asia. Now, one of the things that's happening here during this time is that the British East India Company, once a corporation independent of the Crown, is being slowly bought up by the Crown. So it's becoming almost a government-run entity itself. Now, by 1858, the Crown and Parliament assert direct control over the entire Indian subcontinent, creating what's called the British Raj. So what we know as British India was a much larger area than the contemporary nation of India. It consisted of the contemporary nations of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and parts of what is now Myanmar, although those were partitioned from the rest of India much earlier. They were actually partitioned into a separate country, or a separate dominion, in 1937, right, before India and Pakistan achieved independence. All right, now this is a map of what British India looked like in 1937, before the territory then called Burma, now called Myanmar, was partitioned off. The pink areas represent provinces that were directly administered by the British. The yellow areas represent regions that were ruled by independent princes who nonetheless typically had to toe the British line. Essentially, their rulership of their particular states was dependent upon maintaining the good graces of the British. And here, in white, we have that little sort of fiefdom of Goa, which was Portuguese territory. Right, and the Bombay territory was administered from Mumbai, the Madras territory administered from, of course, Madras, and the very large Bengal territory administered from Kolkata. To use their British names, right, Bombay and Calcutta. So after the First World War, in which a number of soldiers from British India served with distinction, India itself asserts greater independence from Britain. It joins the League of Nations in 1920 as a country in its own right. Now, India at this time, remember, still includes Pakistan and Burma. And in 1920 participates in the Antwerp Olympics as British India. So they're making small moves that assert for themselves a separate non-British identity, right? They're asserting themselves as more than simply a colony. Now, in 1935, the British Parliament passes the Government of India Act, which allows for limited self-government in Indian provinces. There's still, decisions of these local governments were still subject to British approval, but this was a step in the direction of greater independence. Now, in 1945, as World War II comes to a close, there's a parliamentary election in Britain, and Winston Churchill's Conservatives are defeated by Clement Attlee's Labour Party. Now, the Labour government that is elected is much more sympathetic to Indian independence than the outgoing Conservative government was. So, Attlee's government works in concert with officials in India to try to work out a plan to essentially grant India what would have been called, what was called dominion status, right? A dominion of the British Crown was a self-governing nation that nonetheless recognized the British monarch as its head of state. So a dominion of India would have ruled itself, governed its own affairs, but would still be required to pay homage to, I believe at the time, would have been King George. And then the 1946 elections in India happened, and the two leading anti-colonialist parties, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, win enormous victories. Now, the fact that the Indian National Congress has such an overwhelming presence in Hindu areas, and that the Muslim League is so overwhelmingly dominant in Muslim areas, means that the chances of finding a solution that maintains the integrity of the country as a whole, right, that keeps the whole of India under one border, that becomes increasingly unlikely. So Britain and the Congress Party both desire a united India, but the Muslim League continues to press for a two-state solution. Given that Muslims were a minority population in much of India, and the country was prone to outbursts of sectarian violence. So, while Muslims were a minority in the whole of the country, they were a majority in the state of Baluchistan, in Jammu and Kashmir, in part of the Punjab, and in Bengal, which becomes eventually becomes East Pakistan and becomes Bangladesh eventually. So what the Muslim League wants to do then is remove these majority Muslim areas, ostensibly to protect Muslim citizens from violence, but also to protect the holdings of wealthy Muslim landowners from seizure by the state. One thing that a lot of Muslim League members were worried about were the socialist tendencies of some members of the Indian National Congress and the Hindu nationalist tendencies of others. So there's a kind of double motivation there for trying to pull, majority Muslim regions out of a united India. And I mean, one thing that we can see here as well, and this was fairly common in most British administered colonies, what we have here is not a culturally or linguistically united entity, right? What we would call a nation state, right? A state that bases its definition of citizenship on shared culture, shared ethnicity, right? What we have instead are a number of micronations that are culturally different, where many different languages are spoken. In fact, after partition, there are language riots in some regions, particularly nasty in Mumbai or Bombay. So cultural cohesion is the sort of thing that was always going to be a problem, and that was often a problem for post-colonial nations, right? Once the colonial strongman that held everybody else together in opposition disappears. So these are the four men who are probably most responsible for what the Indian subcontinent looks like after 1947. Right. The British gentleman here is Lord Mountbatten, the last British Viceroy of India, who was a military man rather than a politician. And he was responsible largely for getting the various involved parties to agree to partition and to what borders they would accept, right? Setting where the borders were going to be. This is Mohandas Gandhi, a British-trained lawyer who was the leader and spiritual father of the Indian National Congress, and a towering figure on the Hindu side of the Indian movement for independence. Though he also tended to preach tolerance, particularly of those who were not Hindus with a caste, right? So people who would be called untouchables, or today would be called Dalit. Gandhi had wanted a united India. but in order to maintain peace, was willing to agree to and sort of put his signature on this particular agreement. Now, the man next to him in the black hat is Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And Jinnah was the leader of the Muslim League and the father of Pakistan as an independent nation. Right? It was Jinnah who pushed hardest for a two-state solution that would separate out Muslim majority areas from Hindu majority areas. This is why, by the way, Pakistan, when it was first founded, was not contiguous, right? West and East Pakistan shared a government, but India was kind of in the way. It was between the two of them. And this is the first prime minister of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru. And Nehru's family are still a very, very potent political force in India. His daughter, Indira Gandhi, was prime minister for a very long time. And her son, Rahul, I think, maybe no, I think Rahul is her grandson, is sort of the current leader of the Indian National Congress, which is out of power right now. But on midnight, August 14th, 15th, these four men go to what was the BBC station in New Delhi, and they announce that two new states will be created at the stroke of midnight. Pakistan's official Independence Day is August 14th, India's August 15th. So this is what the new map then looks like. And we see here on the map as well, there are still these Portuguese and French cities and outposts whose status remained unresolved. But yeah, the dark gray areas are Pakistan. The pink area is India. Now, certain parts remain disputed. For example, up at the tip here, the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan claims Jammu and Kashmir as a Muslim-majority area. India also lays claim to Jammu and Kashmir, and the Kashmiris, many of them prefer the idea of their own independent state as they feel no close cultural ties to either India or Pakistan. So these are the kinds of disputes that arise when there's no longer a unifying invading force to rally the people against. Now, this region here, in green and in light blue, this is Punjab, where this particular novella takes place. The green portion is the part that's in Pakistan, where Lahore is the major Pakistani Punjabi city, and the light blue is the Indian portion of Punjab, where Amritsar, which is the holy city of the Sikhs, is located. Right? That's the major city in Indian Punjab. So, because Punjab had a much more kind of mixed population than most other states of the British Raj, it was partitioned when the nation was. Right? Large Muslim population, large Hindu population, large Sikh population. So what this meant was that Hindus and Sikhs who lived in the western portion of Punjab were expected to relocate to India, and Muslims who lived in East Punjab were expected to relocate to Pakistan. And this led to a great deal of displacements, refugees wandering from place to place, sort of people waiting for a very long time in camps to be relocated, and also intensified intercommunal violence. right, one thing that we see in this particular novel, right, is there seems to be, at the beginning of the novel, for the most part, a kind of uneasy truce, at the very least, between people of different religions who live in the same village. Rashida's action against Puro's family, we're told, has nothing to do with religion and everything to do with class and economics, right? Puro's family had financially ruined Rashida's family. And so he's taking action again. He's sworn to take action against them for that past slight. When Puro's brother burns Rashida's crops, right, that's a personal vendetta. It's not a religious or ethnic vendetta. Then, later on, in the portion of the novel that takes place after partition, we see that bride kidnapping is taking place on a larger scale due to this religious and cultural upheaval, right? It's no longer for personal reasons or for, economic reasons, class reasons. It is to spite people of the other faith. Now this is Amrita Pritam in middle age. She's born in 1919. Her father was a Sikh scholar, poet, and preacher. Lived much of her early life in Lahore, so in the biggest city in what would become the eastern portion of West Pakistan. And she lived there until about 1947. So essentially she lived there until partition, when Sikhs were being moved out of what was now Pakistan into India. And she began publishing poems, mostly romantic poems, as a teenager. Married in 1935, divorced her husband in 1960. What she did for a living for most of her career was radio work. She worked as a young woman for Lahore Radio, and then later for All India Radio after partition, right, after she was relocated to India. Right, she left Pakistan as a refugee in 1947 and migrated to New Delhi and edited a major monthly literary magazine in the Punjabi language that was read across both borders by Muslims, by Sikhs, by Hindus, basically by all speakers of Punjabi. She is regarded as she's regarded by Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs as a Punjabi writer, like a sort of someone who speaks to their particular cultural time and place, rather than as an Indian writer. And she died in 2005 after a lengthy illness. Now, let's talk about the major issue at the center of this novel. Right? There was a rash of kidnappings of women and young girls in 1947 and 1948 as the partition-related relocations caused a great deal of intercommunity chaos. So there were Muslims kidnapping Hindu and Sikh women, Hindus and Sikhs kidnapping young Muslim women, and sort of forcing them to marry, usually sons of the family, and then to convert to a new religion. Between 75,000 and 100,000 young women are known to have been abducted. So in 1948, the Indian and Pakistani governments worked together to institute a program to find these young women who had been kidnapped and to return them to their original families. And I think that in some ways this novel is a critique of that particular program. if we look at Poirot's seemingly idyllic life as a rich young Hindu girl at the beginning of the novel, and her subsequent life as a comparatively poor Muslim woman after her abduction, it would seem that she is reduced in status, right? But let's think a little bit harder about this, about the way the novel presents Poirot / Haneda, the name she takes after her marriage to Rashida. Let's look at the way the novel presents her specific case. So her husband, right, this young, handsome, wealthy man, Ramchand, is chosen for her by her parents. Now we see later in the novel that these kinds of marriages often don't work out so well, don't take into account the preferences of the young people involved. For example, when Haneda befriends the young woman Taro, who was married off by her family and didn't realize that her husband had a mistress who was not of a high enough class for him to marry, and that he prefers the mistress to his wife. We see in the case of the mad woman, right? She's pregnant, but she's been poisoned by her rich husband's rival wife, which has caused her to lose her wits. And in a lot of ways, Haneda has the central character has a lot more agency as Haneda, the kidnapped bride, than she had as Poirot, the young rich girl. Right? Rashida, in an effort to atone for what he had originally done to her, taking her away from her family, the family which, by the way, rejects her when she comes back because she has been touched by a Muslim and thus polluted. He spends the rest of their lives together trying to atone for this, right? He helps kidnap from another family. He helps to re-kidnap Hameda's brother's wife, right, who's been taken by a Muslim family in another village. On top of that, right, Haneda herself seems to care less about the rules about who she can be friends with, right? She befriends that girl Kamo, who comes to love and trust her more than her own family, even though she's not supposed to eat any food that Haneda gives her, or let Haneda touch any food that she's going to eat, or let Haneda touch the water that she carries, right? Finally, we note that even when given the chance to return to her family and relocate to India and restart the life that was interrupted when Rashida took her, she chooses not to do that. She chooses instead to remain with Rashida. Let's look at the passage here where that occurs. If you look on page 124, Haneda put the silk clothes and candy in Layo's hands, embraced her warmly many times, then suddenly clasped her brother to her bosom. "Poirot," said her brother, grabbing her by the arm, "this is your only chance." Haneda understood what he was saying, and for a brief moment was overcome by temptation. She knew she had only to say that she was a Hindu, and they would take her, put her in the bus, and take her back to her people. Like Layo, like thousands of other women in the country, she too could. But she made her brother release her arm, turned back to where Rashida was standing, and clasped her son to her bosom. When Laya was welcomed back in her home, then you can take it that Puro has also returned to you. My home is now in Pakistan, she said to her brother. Whether one is a Hindu girl or a Muslim one, whoever reaches her destination, she carries along my soul also, Puro said to herself, and made a last vow by closing her eyes. The bus started on its journey, leaving the deserted road in clouds of dust. So this is the thing that I really want you to think about. This I think is really kind of the crux of the novel here. Why does Haneda stay here in Pakistan rather than moving on, going to India with her brother and her original family? What does this mean? What does it mean that the brother specifically calls her Puro here, but the narrator continues to refer to her as Haneda? Right. These are the big issues at the heart of this novel, and this is really what I want you to try to focus your response papers and your comments on. Okay, so next week we're going to be talking about the first half of Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses, which is probably the best novel I've read anyway, concerned with the Indian diaspora in Britain. So we'll cover that next Monday. We'll see you then.